Good morning. I'm John Bitson, the Menard Family Director of the Sheila and Robert Challey Institute for Global Innovation and Growth. Welcome to the Human Progress and Flourishing workshop. In this workshop, we bring in scholars from across the country to present their research and engage in a discussion with the NDSU community. Topics focus on opportunity, innovation, and ways to increase individual and societal flourishing. I'm super excited that today we're joined by Dr. Ilana Redstone. Ilana Redstone is the founder of Diverse Perspectives Consulting and president of the Mill Center for the Advancement of Critical Thinking. She is also co-author of Unassailable Ideas, How Unwritten Rules and Social Media Shape Discourse in the American Higher Education. She's a faculty fellow at Heterodox Academy and the creator of the Beyond Bigots and Snowflakes video series. And you also have a class called that as well. It'd be a fun class to take, I think. And she's an associate professor of sociology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She has a joint PhD in demography and sociology from the University of Pennsylvania. And she said that this is as far north as she has been at this time of year. So again, we're welcoming Ilana with the great weather today. And so we'll have about 10 minutes or 15 minutes for questions after her presentation. So please have your questions ready, and I'm really excited, and please welcome Ilana Redstone. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, I think I'm on here. Hopefully there will be more than just 10 or 15 minutes for questions. I hopefully will, yes, so I'd like to have more time than that. But thank you very much for having me and for being here. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to talk about, so I do work, as John described, in the area of, you could describe it, viewpoint diversity, political polarization, communication across ideological divides. I don't think any of those terms are great, but in the absence of a better one, that's what I'm going with. And so, but what I'm really interested in my work and sort of the conversation that I'm interested in is in constructive engagement. Not about debates, not even so much, it actually, the way that I'm approaching this goes beyond civil discourse. And so that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. And so a piece of that is what I'm calling the uncertainty principle. And as it says underneath, constructive engagement in 6 words. So you will have to wait until the end of the talk to get those magical 6 words. But what I'm going to argue is that we can get to constructive engagement in essentially 6 words. And I'll spend the talk, I think, hopefully convincing you that that's the case. All right, so John, let me see if I can get this to advance. Oh, yep. John did introduce me already. So these are some of the organizations that I am affiliated with or started in various ways. So I don't need to say more about that. So here's where we're starting. So the problem, as I see it, or the problem that I'm trying to solve, and I think most people would agree, perhaps we would have a disagreement about degrees, but I think probably most people need not a lot of convincing that this is in fact a problem, which is that we've largely lost the ability to have conversations about many sensitive and controversial issues. And so in particular, I'm talking about issues that touch topics of identity, ideas of identity, sort of who we are, who we think we are, how we conceptualize that, how we should conceptualize that. Fairness, what does it mean for something to be fair? Who decides? Intent, what is the role of intent? You go all the way from intent is everything to intent is nothing. And racism, and you could include sort of sexism and other forms of bigotry in that as well. And so these are the topics that that I'm focused on. And the reality that we have lost the ability to have conversations on these topics, this is obviously the result of a lot of complicated factors. I don't mean to suggest that it's the result of one singular factor. But what I'm going to argue is that somewhere along the way, we became unable to recognize that there are multiple ways to view these topics that are morally legitimate. And so what do I mean by morally legitimate? So you could say, well, I mean, I understand what it moral means, and I understand what legitimate is, but I'm not sure what you mean when you put those words together. So moral legitimacy, a morally legitimate idea, as I'm using this term, or a position, is one that someone can hold and not automatically be considered odious, sinister, or to have their character questioned. So what does that mean? Like, what could be an example of that? So for example, if I say, here's my position. I don't think that anyone should be attacked while walking down the street. I'm not sure you're going to find anyone who's going to consider that a morally sort of odious position, right? That's just pretty basic. I think everyone should be allowed and permitted and have the right to walk down the street, and the expectation that they can walk down the street and not be attacked. That would be considered by pretty much everyone, I would think, to be a morally legitimate position. Now, what if I said something like, and I'm going to give an example that makes me uncomfortable to even say it because I'm not a fan of it, obviously, but I need to give it an example of a morally illegitimate position. I'm not endorsing this. This is an example. We should kick dogs for fun, right? Don't do this. No, right? So this would be, by anyone's estimation, a morally illegitimate perspective, right? Position to take. There's no way that you could endorse that statement and not rightfully have your character called into question, right? There's just no way. So those would be two extremes. So getting at this idea of moral legitimacy. So those would be two examples. So what about statements like, so those are easy, right? So what about statements like that are harder, that touch these issues of identity, fairness, intent, all of the things that I was just listing at the beginning. So I'm going to give you 3 examples. I think trans women shouldn't be allowed to compete in women's category sports. I'm not endorsing or condemning any of these positions. Or I think we shouldn't factor race into school admissions decisions. Or I don't think people should have to get vaccinated against COVID. I'm just giving 3 examples. Are these morally, you don't have to answer this right now, are these morally legitimate positions? Some people would say, obviously, yes. Some people would say, absolutely not. There's no way. And so this, what I would argue is this is really sitting at the core of a lot of why these issues are hard to engage on. So what does moral legitimacy have to do with these topics? So without a sense that someone can see the same issue, have the same information, and come to a different conclusion and still be a good person, a culture that allows for a diversity of perspectives really isn't possible. You can't have, because when you don't see an alternative perspective as potentially morally legitimate, now that we've sort of defined that term, everyone who might hold that idea or that position is by definition going to be a terrible person, if you think about the kicking dogs example, right? So another way to think about this is the problem of binary thinking, right? Which is something that I know has been written about a great deal. I'm thinking in terms of good and evil. So for example, either you think that, just to apply it to the ones that we said before, either you think that trans women should be allowed to compete in women's category sports, or you're transphobic. Or either you think that race should be a factor in school admissions, or you're racist. And so the way to moral legitimacy, the path forward, is through this, what the title of the talk is, through this uncertainty principle. And to be clear, and I'll make this point, I want to make this point a couple times during the talk. If you just take those 2 examples that I gave, like, right, so I said, either you think trans women should be allowed to compete in women's category sports, or you're transphobic. There's nothing that I'm saying, there's nothing in what I'm arguing that says that there aren't people who are deeply transphobic who have that opinion. There is nothing in what I'm saying that says that that's not a real thing and that doesn't exist, or that there aren't people who are deeply racist who believe that we should not use race as a factor in school admissions. There's nothing that I'm saying that suggests that those people aren't real, that they don't exist, that that's not true. So there's nothing that, right? So I just want to be super clear about that. So the uncertainty principle that I'm talking about leads to binary thinking. I'm sorry, it breaks down binary thinking. So the other way around, breaks down binary thinking. So the uncertainty principle requires recognizing and, when possible, avoiding 3 overlapping fallacies or distortions. And I am waiting for somebody to argue with me about whether it's a fallacy or a distortion or whether I'm using the wrong term. I'm going to let the psychologists and the philosophers sort of hash it out. But what I'm talking about are 3 essential, what I'm thinking of as distortions. One of them is the settled question fallacy, and we'll talk about all of these. One is the settled question fallacy, and there's overlap between all of these, right? They are very much intertwined, but I think it's useful to think about them as distinct. The second is the fallacy of known intent, and the third is the fallacy of equal knowledge. It is true that even by writing this one, the second one on the slide in particular, the fallacy of known intent, that is assuming I am making the assumption that intent matters. And that is true. And we could have a separate discussion about, the arguments that some people will make that intent doesn't matter. I'm happy to have that conversation. It's a little bit separate. So I'm starting with the assumption that intent does matter. I'm not saying that it's everything, but that it matters. And so these are claims of unwarranted certainty when we sort of fail to pay attention to these that block constructive engagement. So in thinking about using this principle, what I'm calling the uncertainty principle, one of the requirements for it to work, this is something else that I want to be clear about, is not just that you're pointing out, sort of identifying and pointing out uncertainty in what the other person is saying. It's very much where you are pointing it out and seeing it in your own thoughts, opinions as well. So there's nothing in what I'm saying that is sort of about, how do I find that gotcha that really sort of takes down the other guy's argument? That's not the point. That's not where I'm going. This is about thinking about what you know and what you understand about the world. And you are finding the uncertainty because it's there. I guarantee you it's there in what the other person's saying. And you're also recognizing your own. Because there's a lot more uncertainty than what a lot of us are willing to recognize. So that, again, that is very much a two-way street. Okay. So these distortions, what I'm thinking of as distortions in thinking, they could be, for example, assumptions we make without knowing it, the 3 that we're going to talk about, conclusions that we jump to without real justification. These all sort of would fall into that bucket. Some of these may be some distortions that would be similar to this, similar to what I'm describing, might be familiar to you. So, for example, you might hear of certain logical fallacies, and these are not 3 that I came up with. These are just common logical fallacies, just as examples, so you can see kind of the landscape of where this might all fit in. One being the ad hominem fallacy, where you use personal attacks rather than logic to sort of take down a person rather than idea. An appeal to pity sort of attempts to pull on people's heartstrings and emotions to win an argument rather than factual evidence. Or the straw man argument, sort of making almost a caricature of the opposing argument so that it's easy to take down. I mean, if you think about just the metaphor, right? The straw man. What's a straw man? Well, it's a man made of straw. So it's very easy to just kind of go, and the whole thing falls down. So these are just examples of sort of other distortions in thinking or cognitive distortions or logical fallacies. The other point I want to be clear about, and then I'm going to talk about on the next slide. This is, again, I want to re-emphasize that this is about constructive engagement. It's not about winning an argument. It's not about getting everybody to a point where they agree on everything. It's not about a debate. And so I think that is something that's important to remember as we go forward. So, okay, I've told you what it's not about. Well, what is it? It's about living with the disagreement. Again, and I'm talking about a narrow set of issues, but they tend to be a narrow set of issues that are extremely sensitive and controversial. So again, issues that touch identity, fairness, intent, and racism. Right? So it's about living with the disagreement. It's about understanding why we disagree in the first place. And it's about realizing that on a wide range of issues, people of reasonable minds can come to different, with reasonable minds, and what we'll add is, and with the same information, can come to very different conclusions. Okay. So by way of context, we can recognize that on certain topics, this is easy, right? It's not like every disagreement gets people's defenses raised and sort of gets everybody fired up. There are certain things where this is pretty easy. And some of the examples that the right way to hang toilet paper, or the best movie of the last 10 years, or the best pizza place in town, we're usually pretty happy to disagree. Now, I will say, that is not to say that other arguments don't get heated, right? You could argue about the right way to hang toilet paper. You could go into your friend's house and take all the toilet paper rolls and flip them over. You could have a heated argument about the best pizza place in town. But most of those cases, even if those arguments get heated, you are not going to end up questioning the moral character. So going back to this idea of moral legitimacy, you are not going to be questioning the moral character of the person that you're disagreeing with. Right? It's just, I mean, again, I suppose you could, it's just not likely. So there is a difference in terms of these types of disagreements. So if we go back, so on the ones we just said, sorry, on the ones that are on the slide, we are pretty happy to disagree. But if we go back to the issues that we started out with at the beginning of the talk, so remember these from earlier, issues that touch identity, fairness, intent, racism. Are these also things that we can disagree on? And I'm going to argue, obviously, actually, when the goal of constructive engagement and what we're talking about here, yes, in most cases, I'm sure someone could find a case where the answer would be a lot harder to say. It would be a lot harder to say yes, but on a pretty wide range, the answer is in fact yes. Okay. So the settled question fallacy is the first of the three that I introduced, right? The settled question fallacy, the fallacy of known intent, and the fallacy of equal knowledge. So the settled question fallacy is when we behave as if there's a broad consensus on answers to important and controversial questions, when that is not in fact the case. So again, this question of sort of what do we know? Why do we know it? What makes us, how sure can we be? If you think of how sure you could be about something on a spectrum, right, from 100% to 0, right? Like if I say, I'll just give you an example. Like if I say, water turns to ice at 32 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm pretty sure. I can do the experiment myself. I can be pretty sure. That would be pretty far, maybe even 100%, right? Like, and then, but some of the other claims that we're talking about, the settled question fallacy is really when we treat a belief or a claim as though it belongs somewhere on one end of the spectrum, where it really, it's actually a lot less certain than we think it is. And a particularly pernicious form of the settled question fallacy appears when one side of the political spectrum asserts that a question is no longer up for debate. I don't care what side of the political spectrum it is, right? When a question becomes no longer up for debate, when it really should in fact be a subject of, we don't know the answer. And so it is open to criticism, it is open to debate. Okay. So what does this look like? I told you this is all about sort of the most sensitive and controversial issues that you could want to or not want to face. So when there's evidence, what does this look like? The settled question fallacy. When there's evidence available to support competing conclusions. So what would be an example of that? For instance, the relationship between gender and biology. You want to find competing claims about what we know about the relationship between gender and biology and what's socially constructed and what's biological, and are we blank slates or are we not, right? You can find a mountain of evidence to support whatever position you want. So that would be one example. Another example would be when a claim is nearly impossible to prove or disprove. So for example, claim inequality is due entirely to structural factors. That's a pretty strong claim. Is it true? I don't know. Can you prove it? Not really. Can you disprove it? No, not really. Right. So this is the area, this is when the settled question fallacy. But if you want to take either of those and treat them as though they are, we have ironclad certain answers to those, those would be examples of the settled question fallacy. The fallacy of known intent. And again, I did say these are all related. When we act as though we know someone's intent when they say or do something that we find objectionable. Again, this is with the assumption that their intent matters. We can make this mistake for events in the current moment or in the past. We can project, we can commit the fallacy of known intent when we're looking at events in the past or in the present. And what sits under this is that we can know so we can know what someone's thinking, right? That we can know what someone's motivation is. All right, so the third, actually, let me give an example of that before I go into the third one. When there is only one possible motivation for an utterance or an action. So for example, J.K. Rowling says she believes in biological sex. I don't remember exactly what her exact quote was. I'm sure we could all go look it up on Twitter. But just the summary was, J.K. Rowling says she believes in biological sex. She must be transphobic because there's no other possible reason that she could hold such a position. So this is, and you can see how this ties to the settled question fallacy, because again, you're making sort of assumption. There are implicit assumptions underneath about what we know about the relationship between sex and biology. But what we're focusing on here is what we know, or what we behave as though we know about her intent. And so that would be an example, again, of what I'm calling the fallacy of known intent. Okay, and then the third one is the fallacy of equal knowledge. So the assumption that on controversial topics, if we all had the same information, we'd all agree. And it's usually offered, when I hear this the most, it is usually offered, I suppose it could come up in various ways, but the way I hear it more often than any other, it is offered as a charitable way to understand why someone on the other side doesn't agree with a particular position on a controversial issue. The problem is that what sits under this is the following claim. If we all had the same information remember, I'm talking about this narrow subset of issues. If we all had the same information, we'd all agree. Now, once you frame it that way, most people are like, well, no, that doesn't sound right. Right? I don't think that's necessarily the case, but that is essentially what sits underneath this, whether you recognize it or not. That's what's sitting underneath it. So what would be an example of this? This actually was an experience that I had. Again, I promised you controversy. This is an example that I had, an experience that I had in a class. And so this would be an example of the fallacy of equal knowledge. So an example was asking a group, this happened to be a group of students, whether someone could reasonably view the killing of George Floyd through the lens of bad policing and not through the lens of race. Again, I am using this as an example. I'm neither endorsing nor condemning any of the arguments that I'm putting up here. And so in that case, 60% of the group said yes. Right. So this was on a Zoom poll. This is when we were only teaching online. And so 60% of the group said yes. And then as the conversation went forward, it made clear that it was clear that they had that there was something very specific that many of them had in mind. And so I rephrased the question and I asked the same question and I said, okay, asking a group whether someone could reasonably view the killing of George Floyd through the lens of bad policing and not through the lens of race, if they had the same information you have. And that percentage dropped in half. Right. So that, I mean, you could say, well, it's still 30%. That's not terrible. So, but it did drop in half. It dropped from 60 to about 30%. And so what I'm saying, this fallacy that it's information that makes people disagree. It's a lack of information on these sets of issues. Right. I think it gets in the way. Because it does assume that all I have to do is tell this other person what I think. Tell them why I think what I think. Tell them what my worldview is, and they will get on board. And it doesn't work. And you may have had the experience that it doesn't work. So the uncertainty principle. So I'm going to say that embracing uncertainty can lead to all kinds of positive things. It can also lead to a bit of a philosophical rabbit hole, but it can lead to a lot of positive things, including better communication, better solutions to really complicated problems, social problems, because we can communicate better, less political polarization, and lower levels of resentment. Right. And so we can, if we have time, if anyone has questions, we can talk about why it would lead to all of those things. Ignoring it can lead to, well, other things, less positive things. We can apply it to an example. So what do we know? Let's apply this to the example of educational inequality. So you could think of this in lots of different ways. Inequality in educational attainment, whatever outcome you want to think about. And so what do we know about the causes of educational inequality? So I'm going to start with a headline. This is a headline from the Washington Post in June of 2021. And I just took 2 clips from the headline. No systemic racism, look at student achievement gaps in reading. Admitting the systemic racism in American education is a necessary step toward ending it. And so I want to see how our framework holds up with this claim. And this was not, for the record, and if I'm not misremembering, this was not from an op-ed piece. This was reporting. This was not an opinion piece. And so a lot of times, I'm using this as an example because a lot of times when I talk about a topic like that, like a disparity that people are concerned about, and rightly so, right? A disparity in educational attainment, which is something that we should frankly be concerned about. And this headline reflects a lot of sort of the initial almost reflexive answers that I will get in terms of how we think about the causes of that disparity. And so sometimes what will happen, and I know many of you here are students, but what will happen when I ask groups of students, when I bring this topic up in class and to get past the initial response, I will ask students and I'll say, okay, well, you're all successful, and same with the students who are here in this room. You've had some degree of educational success just by dint of the fact that you're here, right? You're here, you're sitting in this room, you're at a 4-year institution, you are on your way to upward socioeconomic mobility, to an education, to everything that entails. So what got you here? And so some of the answers that I'll get will be things like, I went to a good school, or a well-funded school, or whatever it is. I got a scholarship. I had a good teacher. My parents instilled in me the importance of education. I studied. I went to class. I worked hard. I've had students say, my parents are immigrants and they would have killed me if I didn't do well in school. Whatever it is that people will say. And so you could put together essentially a list, right, with all of these things on it, and we could add to it that list. We could put systemic racism on that list, right? Absolutely, that should be on that list. In addition to the list that we just had, and systemic racism is also on that list, no questions asked. And so we have a list. It's probably not an exhaustive list, but it's a list. So how does our framework sort of hold up here? So here's the settled question fallacy. Educational disparities are due, this is going back to the headline, are due to systemic racism. So we know that it's on our list, but we don't know. We also know that there's a large number of other things that are also on our list, just what I just had up on the slide, that usually come from students themselves. Now, no one, I would argue, can really rank order the things on that list in terms of how much they contribute to educational disparities. And again, I'll emphasize something that we should care about. Systemic racism, going to a good school, studying, whatever. What is that? If you had to, assign percentages, how much do these different things contribute to educational success? Which is what we're talking about when we're talking about educational disparities. You can't do it. No one can. You don't know. It's not a settled question. We don't know. I don't know, and neither do you, how to apportion blame in terms of how we're thinking about it. So that would be an example of the settled question fallacy. In that example, the fallacy of known intent would be taking that a step further and saying educational disparities are due to systemic racism. And the only reason you'd question that is if you're racist, right? That would be taking it a step further and saying this and going into the fallacy of known intent. Now, again, does that mean that it is certainly the case that there are people who are racist who would say that, right? So that one of the reasons for saying that systemic racism is not a contributing factor is in fact racism. There's nothing that is inconsistent with what I'm saying right. There's nothing that I'm saying that is inconsistent with that. That are people who are driven by true racial animus. Part of what I'm saying and what I'm trying to get people to see is that it is a leap, an unjustified leap to go from saying, yes, there are people who are racist who might deny the importance of the contributions of systemic racism to something like educational disparities. It is a leap to go from there to saying that everybody who questions this is also therefore racist. That is a leap that, then this is the uncertainty that we're talking about, that is not warranted. And so this is the fallacy of known intent. And the third one is the fallacy of equal knowledge. So again, with this idea of educational disparities, if I share with you my understanding of the world that makes me sure that systemic racism is the singular cause of educational disparities, you'll agree with me. This is not likely to work. Maybe there are a handful of cases where that's worked. I would be surprised, because these are fundamentally moral and values laden questions. I'm not suggesting that information doesn't matter. I'm not suggesting that more information isn't good. In no way. I'm just saying that it is a mistake to enter conversations on these topics, assuming that that information alone is going to get everyone on the same page. It's not, because again, to take it to the extreme, if we had all of the same information, would we agree on these topics? We wouldn't. There's no way that we would. So you have to recognize that when we're engaging with other people. So the path forward is to instill and remember how easy it is to fall into these distortions: the settled questions fallacy, the fallacy of known intent, the fallacy of equal knowledge, and realize, particularly when it comes to social problems that have a values laden and a moral component, there is a lot more uncertainty than we often realize. And I want to emphasize again that what I said at the beginning, which is that this is not just you finding uncertainty in somebody's argument that you don't like. This is about you recognizing your own, because there's just a lot when it comes to these topics. There is a lot that we don't know, and that we can't be sure of. And so so again, it is as important to recognize it in yourself as it is in other people. So in the beginning of the talk, I said there are 6 words. I said I could reduce this whole thing, the last 33 minutes, we could reduce it to 6 words. And so what are those 6 words? Find the uncertainty, find the conversation. That's it. If I had to summarize the whole thing, and the uncertainty is there. It's always there. I've not yet been stymied in any way that suggests that it doesn't apply. And I think it applies on all over the political spectrum, even though most of my examples here come more from one side than from the other, which I could explain why that is. I think it goes a long way to explaining things like political polarization. It goes a long way to explaining things like public mistrust, or a deterioration of public trust. And so I think that, again, these 6 words, find the uncertainty, find the conversation, can do a lot in terms of your own engagement, right, with other people, and also just more broadly how we engage with one another. So that's what I would advise as you go forward and move through the world and move through these conversations. So I am happy to take questions, any questions, comments, thoughts, criticisms, complaints, as people would like. So thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to talk. But from here, I am just happy to take any questions as you have them. The floor is, thank you. The floor is totally open. Yeah. Yeah. Um, no, in the sense that I hadn't really thought of it until you just said it right now. But now that you say it, I have heard of the principle of charity. It was not in the back of my mind when I was pulling this all together. This is something that, you know, this is basically what this talk is essentially putting. I'm sorry that I was supposed to repeat the question. The question was about the principle of charity because the people who are online cannot hear your question. So the question was whether the incorporating the principle of charity, where the overlap was intentional. It wasn't. So what I was saying was that this is really trying to kind of tie up and put a bow on what I've been doing for years, and just I would get questions like, well, what can I do? Or like, what do you, and I was just like, I don't know, I can't explain it. I just kind of, whatever this. And so this is really just putting that together. I can totally see the overlap. It wasn't in the back of my mind, but yes, I can definitely see the overlap. Yeah.
So I've got I worked in some questions from online.
Okay.
So this first question is about the issue of consensus.
Okay.
So if a question is settled among experts, but is not widely accepted among non-experts, is it settled?
Should I repeat that again? Okay. If a question is settled among experts and it's not settled among non-experts, is it settled? I think it depends. That's a good question. I think it would depend on how. I'm just trying to think of examples. I'm sure that person has an example in mind that when they ask the question, I'm trying to think of what it brings to my own mind. I would think it depends on how much the issue at hand touches these sort of moral and value laden questions. Like, so for example, so my discipline of sociology, you know, there are a lot of, you could get a room full of experts, and this is probably not what the person had in mind, but this is where my head goes. You could get a room full of experts in sociology. I've no doubt, I've never done this, but I've no doubt you could get a room full of experts in sociology that would have total consensus among themselves about how the world, like sort of all of these many of these topics about identity and fairness and equality and sort of structural inequality, you would get full agreement about them. I don't think it would make it a settled question. You know, if you take a group of experts, you know, a group of, I'm just thinking like, you know, physicists or whatever, and you're talking about, I don't know, I'm not a physicist, you're talking about the latest theories about the expansion of the universe or something. And that strikes me as different again, because it's the issues where the rubber meets the road here is really on the issues where somebody's character comes into question. And so I would think that on those issues, I think that it's probably not a settled question on those issues, on many, and I don't know what the person had in mind, but on those issues where there's a really strong sort of moral and values laden component to it, because I don't see how it could. But maybe the person has an example in mind that would, you know, totally undo everything I just said, but that's sort of my initial answer, my initial thought. I know you had a question.
Yeah, kind of piggybacking off of the audience question. The way that science should be functioning is that an expert who disagrees with another expert conducts another study refuting or verifying the conclusion from that research.
Mm-hmm.
But, and we kind of touched on this at breakfast this morning, with the advent of social media and blogging, we no longer have this path where if someone disagrees with a scientific finding, they conduct a study to counteract the results. They just let people know their viewpoint. And I'm gonna pick on a Nobel laureate in my field. Paul Krugman has been wrong on inflation for going on a year now, but he carries the clout of the Nobel Prize winner who is writing for the New York Times, and that is to a certain extent now being taken as very reputable sources, even though he's not doing the research to be able to engage with that. So I don't remember, I wasn't an academic in the 1990s, but how has social media and a bunch of really well-educated people always wanting to share their opinions with everyone else kind of impacted the trajectory of science in the way that people are now receiving it in things being decisive?
So I don't even know how to boil that down. How has social media, I mean, it's to bring in the New York Times, also mainstream media sort of reshaped what is considered settled and what I think is, I'm not, you said it much better than I am, but, so there's a lot in the question. So just quickly, like, and in the Unassailable Ideas book, my co-author and I talk about this in the sense of, the role of Twitter. Like you're saying, okay, well, there was a time when if somebody had a finding that if there was a conclusion that was drawn from a study and somebody didn't believe it, thought it was wrong, whatever, they would do another study and see if they drew a different conclusion, or they'd write a rebuttal about why they think, the methods were shoddy or whatever. And now what we say in the book is that Twitter has a seat at the table. Which is definitely here. I mean, there are a number of examples that we go into in the book. One of them, one of the most prominent ones that comes to mind is Lisa Littman, who, she was the public health specialist or researcher at Brown a couple of years ago, who coined the term rapid onset gender dysphoria. And so she had a publication, she had a paper in, you can look this up. She had a paper that was published in PLOS One, and then essentially her research was viewed understandably as threatening to the trans community, because they felt like, because basically if you take her conclusion one step further, the concern was that you're telling parents, or that parents could take this information and essentially question their late adolescent, young adult child's claims that they want to transition, because her point was that, like, there are peer effects and whatever, and we shouldn't just sort of immediately jump on board with affirmation, whatever. And so that was a concern from the trans community. And what ended up happening was that through Twitter and through sort of a public media outreach campaign, she did end up, I think the paper was ultimately published, but it was subject to another round of review and, like, heavily scrutinized and everything else. And she had all kinds of professional ramifications at Brown University. And so, yeah, Twitter, there's no question. I mean, I think it's crazy that Twitter has a seat at the table. I mean, that makes, but that is it. Absolutely. There are venues where that should be aired. And there are procedures in place that should be, but part of it, I mean, there's a bigger question about, sort of that someone would ask about, what is the role of knowledge in terms of protecting marginalized groups versus, right, this is the question that someone would ask, versus, the pursuit of truth. And I mean, I would say I have a very clear perspective of where I would land on that, which is that, look, like, you're going to have to land on the side of truth. I mean, which is again, a word that gets manipulated and sort of used in strange ways, but you can't protect people. This is not the right way to do it. And so, yeah, so there's the Twitter having a seat at the table. Your Paul Krugman example, I mean, the Paul Krugman example is, I mean, he's obviously an expert, Nobel Prize winning. He also, unless something's changed, he's also exclusively on the opinion pages though, right? So yeah, so he's exclusively in the opinion pages, in contrast to, like, the example that I put up earlier about the Washington Post article that was reporting. So in the opinion pages, there's a huge question about how well we recognize, and I know there are people who have expertise in this, about how we recognize bias in the media, particularly in the mainstream media. And what's always seemed to me, and I've never done these studies, but it seems patently obvious to me that we are very good at recognizing it on the right. So, even people who consume media on the right intentionally, right? So if you want to watch Fox News or, or whatever, it's not a secret that you're going to get and we know what those biases are. We know what the lens looks like. We can sort of describe the contours and the landscape and whatever, and you know what you're getting, even if that's what you make the affirmative choice to consume, right? I think we do a far worse job of identifying it on the left. And the New York Times I would put into that bucket. I think we just are I think we just fail, put a lot tied to the uncertainty principle. I think we just fail miserably when it comes to recognizing bias in mainstream media on the left. And I think that it all ties into what you're saying. So, yeah. 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 So would that lead moral legitimacy to a subjectivist or relativist approach? Yeah. So these are the things that keep me up at night, right? Is these sort of rabbit hole questions of like, well, where does it? We were talking this morning, like you go down the rabbit hole with this stuff. I had a student I'll come back to your question in a second, but I had a student last semester who, after we had been talking about this stuff for 15 weeks, and she was like, she had internalized a lot of it, and she was a very bright student. And she said, kind of sometime toward the end of the semester, she was like, well, where does it end? She's like, what about evolution? What about climate change? and down the rabbit hole. And so I don't have, and I think to some extent, anywhere there's uncertainty, you have to acknowledge it. But going to your question about relativism, and so could you take what I'm saying and say, well, this is an argument for total relativism and that there is no objective truth? Is that sort of what you're saying?
I'm actually more specifically referring to, so moral legitimacy is effectively a standard.
Mm-hmm.
Taking this at some point in time, right?
Sure.
So what is odious under a certain context at a certain point, at a certain time,
Sure.
may not even be odious in that same culture.
Sure. At the same time in a different culture. Yeah. Oh, I see what you're saying. So, yes. So actually, somebody asked me this yesterday. I'm putting your question together with theirs about, it was somebody who was from Pakistan. Yeah, I think it would. I focused so much on most of this is coming from the context that I'm in, right? And so I'm an academic primarily, even though I do a lot of non-academic work. I am in a very, very politically ideological discipline. We are sociology, we are ground zero for a lot of the most ideologically based theories, including critical race theory, like whatever that come out of academia that have jumped the rails, so to speak. And so, I think it's a great question, like how would what I'm saying apply, or would it apply to either different time periods, or different cultures, or both? I don't know. I think the short answer is I don't know. I would love to hear thoughts on whether it would or wouldn't. My intuition is that it would, but I don't know what it would look like.
I bring that up because,
Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. So are you saying that you think that right? So obviously this idea emerges in the 2nd century. So are you saying that what I'm saying, you think it would apply or wouldn't? I'm not sure where you're. Yeah, I think, yeah, I mean, yeah. So I think we're on the same page. I think I don't know. I don't think I'm in a position, like, I don't think I could really articulate my defense of that argument right now, but my intuition definitely is that it would apply. The contours would be a little different depending on sort of what I don't know if there's just such a thing as a moral Overton window, like where that is for the particular culture in a particular time. Yeah, it's a great question. Yeah.
I can ask another online question. I'm going to slightly rephrase this. I think I'm representing the intent right.
Okay.
Basically, I think what they're asking is for practical ideas for how they could use these ideas in a conversation. Like if they wanted to create more clarity and understanding on issues, not in the classroom per se, but like just in real life conversation.
Yeah, I think so how to use these in a practical conversation. So I think that is a very deep question. That it requires a deep answer. I think it is. So what are the questions, for example, about identity, right? And there's a lot of this. So a lot of questions will often come up around, well, who can speak on, and speak on which topic, whose opinion matters, what happens when somebody's lived experience is contradicted by data, these kinds of things. So how do I engage on these topics? So if you take one of those, if you just take identity, right? So what would that look like? I mean, I think it would be thinking about, this is why I'll hopefully expand this into a book, so everyone can just buy it in a year when it's done or whatever. I haven't written it yet. But I think it would be something like, how should, and I'm just using this as an example, just as identity as an example. Identity along the lines of how people normally talk about it, right? So race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, sometimes religion gets tossed in there, sometimes immigration status gets tossed in there. Is this there? You could break it into a couple of different questions. I'm sort of, this is a long answer to the person's question, but how are there people who think about their identity primarily along those axes, right? You could ask yourself this question. Are there people who think about their identity primarily in terms of all of those things that I just said? The answer is unambiguously yes, right? And then there's a separate question about, well, what about people who don't think about their identity that way? How should we think about that? And then there's a totally separate question about how should we think about our identity? What are the implications? This is the uncertainty that I would say that to have that person start thinking about. Although I can't, it is a longer question. So for example, questions like, what does it mean to lean into identity groups? This is the uncertainty. What does it mean to lean into our identity groups? So what do I mean by lean into identity? I mean like you're on a college campus and you spend all of your time in an affinity house. Now, affinity houses have an important role, right? And so this is like the Latino house or the whatever, like those have an unambiguously important role on campus in terms of bringing students together who have shared experiences, who want to engage about whatever, like they have a clearly important role. Can you, and I've had kind of this conversation with students as well, like, can you lean too much? What happens if you lean too much into identity along those lines? What happens? Well, you end up being really divided. It ends up being very divisive. Okay, so now we think that there's a place where there's too much. You can lean into it too much, and then you start to tip over. Well, where's too much? Where's too much? Is too much the same for me as it is for somebody else? Probably not. Who gets to decide what's too much? So this is a long answer to that person's question, which is just, these are things that you are. So it's not a script. What I'm advocating isn't a script or a checklist as much as it's a way of thinking. In terms of okay, well, somebody makes a claim to me about, whatever, about identity, about who can speak on which topic, or about, and I'm going to think about what is the uncertainty in the claim that they're making? What is the uncertainty? What is my own uncertainty? Because the things that I'm telling them that they don't know, I don't really know either. I don't really have the answers to those questions. And so it's about finding the place in the and let me be clear that this will not work with everybody. It just won't, because there are some people that it's not a magic elixir. There are some people who this is just not where they're at, or it's at least not where they're at right now. And it's not going to work. And so I think that's important to keep in mind. But I think it's about, that's a long answer, but hopefully that's helpful for the person who asked the question. But I think it's, read the book. Yeah.
So I think you might be in a somewhat unique position to try to answer this, because you teach these classes, right? You're involved in this activity along with students. And as I'm sure you know, there's a reputation of young people as being on college campuses. I'm not saying I agree with this reputation, but there's this reputation, the snowflake thing that,
Yeah.
That they're intolerant and dogmatic. Do you find that to be true? And now I'm going to put you in a little bit of a tough spot, which is compared to your colleagues.
I think that they're equally narrow. I think they're equally narrow. So are the students as dogmatic as people say that they are, you know, nationally, and are my colleagues sort of narrow. I mean, I think that there's a problem yes, I think there's an enormous problem. I think it's actually really underestimated how pervasive the problem is. I think that because we end up focusing on things like you know, self-censorship, just for an example. And what I'm saying is actually, I'm saying you're not stepping back enough. I'm saying you're at 10,000 feet, go to 30, right? Because what I'm saying is like, look, there's a problem here, even if nobody is self-censoring. There's a problem in how we're thinking about and communicating about these ideas. And that's true within the field of sociology, for sure. Whether it's my colleagues or whether it's somewhere else, it is pervasive within much of the social sciences. And that's true within students. What I will say with students is that I do find that many of them are sort of really curious and wanting to listen and wanting to engage, and they have not been given at any point in their education, and I try to do my small part in in sort of course correcting, but they have not been given the tools, the language, or the framework to sort of think through any of this stuff. And that's true for students who are inclined to agree with it, sort of a more progressive ideology. And that is true for students who are inclined to question it. We have done a disservice, a total disservice to all of them by not giving them the tools, the language, or the framework to think through or engage on these topics. And then we send them out into the world, and we've done this for generations. And so I think it's a huge, and actually there's a circularity even in what you're saying, because the faculty, they were the students, you know, whatever, 20 years ago. And so it's all, then you've got these feedback loops. And so, yeah, I think it's an enormous, and then here's the other thing. It's not actually that hard to fix the problem. It doesn't require like massive resources. It doesn't require new technology. Like, we have everything we need right now to fix the problem. And so which just makes it really, it makes it both, I guess, there's optimism, there's cause for optimism, but it's also very frustrating. So
I was going to suggest that maybe the reason that the students are actually more open-minded with faculty, just from the selection point of view of like faculty who've already made it through.
oh, sure. Right, you're already sort of winnowed down. Right. Yeah, I mean, I do find that students, I mean, you could say in the bigots and snowflakes class that I teach, well, there's this enormous self-selection component and whatever. That's true. Like people who are selecting to be in that class, yeah, that's absolutely true. In the social problems class that I teach, that's a harder argument to make, only because that class is taught by multiple faculty, by multiple instructors. And so I don't know, do I have a particular reputation on campus for this or that? I have no idea. But I do find that students are largely open, interested, and they see it. They just don't know. No one has been given sort of the tools to deal with any of this, or just sort of engage on any of this. And it's really a disservice, I think. So. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, this is, you know, through my consulting work, I've tried to do this work in the corporate space, and also through the Mill Center, which is obviously named after John Stuart Mill, you know, the Mill Center for the Advancement of Critical Thinking. I mean, this is, you know, something the women that I'm doing this with are just getting it off the ground, but absolutely this is completely doable. It takes the will to do it. It takes, in the current climate, it takes a certain amount of courage, I suppose, but it's not impossible. Like there's no barriers to entry. I teach people how to do it, right? Like this is absolutely doable. And so in terms of branding and scaling, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's where I'd like to go, hopefully. But you can't force, you know, when you talk about the school environment, you can't force schools to adopt things. And so they have to recognize it's a funny position to be in, because you're saying like, look, I have the solution to a problem that you really have, but you don't think that you have, or you're not willing to recognize that you have. And it's sort of like, no, but I really have this solution that you need, but you also are trying to convince them that they have a problem. So it's hard. So I want to be respectful of people's time. I don't. Yeah. Thank you so much.